Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm Anna Harvey, President of the Social Science Research Council, and welcome to the College and University Fund Lecture Series for 2024 on the theme of research to solve problems. And so let me just give you a little bit of background as to why we chose this theme for this year's lecture series. I think it's not wildly incorrect to say that for most of us, most of the time, when we start a research project, we're aiming at producing a publication, or hopefully more than one publication, and that goal, the publication, has a pretty large influence on the way we design the research project. And that's not to say that, again, for most of us, most of the time, we wouldn't also be gratified to see that there are some spillover effects, like maybe somebody actually reads our publication and changes something in the world, hopefully for the better. But I think it's generally true that we see the reception of our publications as lying outside of the scope of things that we can control or necessarily should care about. And with this lecture series, Research to Solve Problems, we wanted to question that last premise, namely that there's nothing we can do to influence the reception of the evidence that we produce. And we wanted to ask first, what do we actually know about how evidence is received by policymakers and about the factors that might increase their receptiveness to evidence? But then secondly, what would it look like if we use that knowledge to structure the way that we design our research projects? So what would we do differently if we prioritize not only the publication, but also the reception of the publication by decision makers? So what if we prioritized actually solving the problems in addition to writing about them? What would we be giving up, and would it be worth it? And so to kick us off, as we think about these questions, which I hope you also think are interesting questions, I'm very happy to welcome Stefano Della Vigna from the University of California, Berkeley, one of the member institutions in the Council's College and University Fund for the Social Sciences. Stefano is the Daniel E. Koshland Senior Distinguished Professor of Economics and Professor of Business Administration. He is co-editor of the American Economic Review, which is the flagship journal in economics. And he is, I think, at the forefront of those of us who are thinking about how social science can be useful for decision makers. And it's just one example. Stefano co-founded the social science prediction platform, which you should all go look at after this lecture, which is this really innovative way for social scientists to be useful to policymakers when we don't have rigorous evidence about a particular policy choice. And I think the prediction platform can also be useful for us to help us see when our predictions are quite distant from evidence, as maybe a signal to us about where we should be rethinking some of our theories and models. And I think we may hear about that use of the prediction platform today in Stefano's talk, which is titled Bottlenecks for Evidence Adoption. So Stefano is going to talk for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So put your questions into the Q&A at any time, and then we'll have, I'll read them out for the last 15, 20 minutes or so of our time, and we'll have a conversation. So Stefano, thank you very much for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Anna, for that great, really, there couldn't be a more pertinent introduction. And thanks for everyone for joining here. It is a special pleasure to be talking in this series because the theme that I want to discuss today, the evidence I want to discuss, really is of relevance to kind of any social scientist that tries to do that extra step and go into the implementation, just as Anna said, as I'll go back to. But kind of before I go much further, let me introduce my kind of the two wonderful collaborators in this project. Woojin Kim is a PhD student at UC Berkeley who's done work at intersection in the behavioral economics and political science. And and a postdoc now, and Elizabeth Linos was my colleague at UC Berkeley Goldman School, and now is at the Kennedy School, and kind of a wonderful expert of local governments and nudge units. And for myself, actually, I've come to this putting together two of my hats. One, my main head is behavioral economist, talking about nudge units, you'll hear, and the other head is somebody who really cares about research transparency. The theme that really matters, how we convey research findings and what we do with them. So on that note, let me just kind of get started and say, and I think Anna gave a great summary of this, but most of what we do is we do a research project, and if we're doing an experiment, an RCT, like a kind of randomized trial in the field where we want to do different treatments to control and treatment to see if something works. For example, we have a problem that people are not paying their taxes in time. Could be the garbage tax, could be the income tax, could be the television tax is an example that was studied in Europe. And you design a mailer, so the control group gets the usual bureaucraties letter, and the treatment group gets a simple one that maybe says 95% of people paid by this deadline, or that sort of outlines different forms of encouragement. And then what you do is you compare treatment group and control group, right? And you say, oh, the treatment group actually got, I don't know, half a percentage point sooner repayment, and significant, and all of that. And you're really excited, and you interpret it, and you try to publish it, and you try to spread the word. But often, like, if you hear a paper like that presented, then maybe somebody will say, oh, and you know what, by the way, what the government did with that is often nothing, or like actually got picked up by some particular province in Austria for the TV study and so on. But that doesn't really seem to be central to the publication process. So people think we're done. But again, we shouldn't be done. If we're doing research that is relevant to policy, what do we know about how and whether it gets incorporated to politics? That's the policy. That's the bottleneck idea. Are there bottlenecks in that highway? We'd like it to be a highway. It's not a highway. It's like more like a narrow, winding street that goes from the research findings into policy adoption. And Elizabeth and Woojin and I had done earlier work on this, and about just the first part of it, the RCTs and nudge units, as I'll talk about it. And then somebody said, do we know anything about what the cities and departments did with the findings? And we're like, oh, you know what? That's a great question. We don't know. And in reality, there just isn't that much be known. So from my perspective, coming from economics, some of the areas that have done this, the area of economics called development economics, that mostly sort of does experiments in different countries to study what works better for health, for education, for business entrepreneurship, has done a little bit of this. So here Tetal is a very nice paper which looks, for example, in Brazil, uses a conference of mayors and randomizes which mayors get information, in fact, on a tax repayment letter, and looks at whether they then change the letter that their city sends a couple of years after that. And then some hypothetical kind of evidence from sort of surveys. Let me just kind of circle it, this one. Let me see if I can do this. Let me try one more time to see if I can. There we go here. There we go. This one is sort of survey evidence on the adoption of this about hypothetical policies. There is also evidence on what firms do. I mean, organizations, governments are organizations like firms. And so there is some evidence that firms too struggle to adopt. Just because firms talk and do a ton of A/B testing, it does not mean that necessarily they use the results of A/B testing. That's not what I'm talking today, because we'll be talking about governments. But just to be clear, that's a theme that relates to behavioral firm and firm decision-making. And, going back much earlier, the work of Nobel laureate Herbert Simon and the work of Jim March and others, in organizations, the idea that organizations are behavioral, there is like kind of failures or like bottlenecks in decision-making that are really interesting to study. And so we're kind of trying to take this from this various perspective. What is this map? So this map is a map now, as of a couple of years back already, of nudge units. So you may or may not have heard of nudge units. If you haven't, nudges are small kind of changes to the communication or the wording, the way things are presented, that do not change incentives and do not force choices. So Social Security is not a nudge because you're required to put money away. Also, if I say you have a $10 incentive or a gift card if you do something, that's not a nudge. But if I just change the wording of a letter that tells you that your taxes are overdue, that counts like a nudge. And so in many ways, you can think of it as the nudges that governments use are in part improving that communication in a way that firms, of course, with the marketing department, have been doing for the longest time. But nudges, a concept introduced, or at least a term coined by Richard Taylor and Cass Sunstein in their very well-known book, remarkably led to an adoption of the idea all around the world, starting from the UK, where the first nudge unit, somewhat haphazardly, was founded by Cameron in the UK government. Then it got adopted, and these days it's almost like if you're not a respectable country if you don't have a nudge unit, almost not a respectable city if you don't have your own city nudge unit, if you're a big city. So this is kind of, why would you have all these nudge units? Every local context is a little different. They have a problem to solve. Let's say, for example, it could be people are not recycled enough, or they line up for the driver's license renewal at the version of the DMV, and that creates long lines when they could do it online. So how do you encourage people to do it online? That would be a problem that you could address with better communication, okay? Or you could have people that are not claiming food stamps, so WIC, a problem that I was talking to a county officer this morning. And could you, improve that take-up by appropriate communication? So that's what nudge units do. So here is the part that is kind of special about this paper, and I'll tell you briefly about the background to this, which is that nudge units created an incredible repertoire of knowledge. Because most of us, we run one RCT, then 2 years later, another RCT, another experiment. But nudge units run dozens per year, sometimes, tens of dozens. And so kind of hundreds, and they accumulate all this knowledge. But if you go to their research presentations, often they'll talk about the one or two that are most effective. And so I always, being the annoying academic at the back of the room, is like, this is wonderful, but can we get a sense of the average impact of your experiments? And they're like, oh, we'd love to know that, but we don't really know. And then sort of talking to Elizabeth Linos as she joined Berkeley, she said, oh, I think that we could get the record. And I said, wow, that would be amazing. But it turns out really much to the credit of these extraordinary organizations, BIT North America and OES, those so-called kind of White House nudge unit, they opened their record and they basically said, these are all the RCTs we run to completion with the nudge units. This is the outcome variable that we pre-registered or that we recorded. And if you put the record together, that would be great. And they did it not knowing what the results would be. So this is something, the outcome of that is something that Elizabeth and I document in our econometrica paper that came out years ago. And kind of to this table, let me just read to you what it says, which is, let's say that your outcome variable has an average take-up rate of 17%. So let's say that the share of people that renew the DMV driver's license online, what you would like, is 17.3% on average. It turns out the nudge units increase that by the sum of those two terms. So they bring it to 17.3 plus 1.39. So, 18.7 percentage point, which is about an 8% effect. So that's a pretty sizable impact. And the standard error below tells you it's a highly statistically significant effect. If you sort of read this kind of stuff, is a G of 4.5, etc. And you can do that for all the nudge units or the BIT North America units. What's great about this, we were able to look at this data set where you have, depending whether you call them 1 or 226 different experiments, or 73, which is really something wonderful, because when do we get to look at so broadly a set of experiments that are very different but yet comparable? So that's kind of where we started. But then you kind of look at this and you say, oh, you know what? These trials had an impact on average, but they really varied. Some of the positive, some of the negative. Some were run by cities that had a long record of running experiments and maybe more capacity, some not. Like, what do we know about how they use the results? Because after all, the whole point of these experiments was to achieve the goal, like have people renew the driver's license online as opposed to in person, or have people pay taxes in time. So that was the goal. but did they actually change the wording of the communication following the experiment? And it turns out that the nudge unit had not recorded that. And so we came up with a way to record it. And what we did is we actually followed up with every single one of the RCTs run by BAT North America that runs experiments with US cities. So 30 cities, 60 plus city departments. So some cities, there were experiments run with different departments. And we were able to record adoption for every single one of them. And I have to single out, like in particular, Woojin Kim, that really was extraordinary in being sort of patient and clear, and also BAT that endorsed this, and the cities that really cared to kind of tell us what happened with the evidence. It's quite unusual that there is no selective response, and the selective response here is 0. So for all of them, we basically looked at the form later, or we asked how the form was and compared it to the earlier one. And so it's adoption if the nudge unit treatment became the communication in years since. Okay, so that's the idea, and then I'll talk a little bit about the details. So now, why would you care about this? What could you think? I mean, we started thinking that what you might call the evidence-based view. If an RCT is successful, just to speak a bit loosely about it, it'd be adopted. So if you find an effect that is positive and significant, you'd expect to be adopted. If it's like 0 or negative, you won't adopt it. That would be presumably the way we think about it, also normatively. But there is other models. It could be that it depends a lot on the organization. Does the organization have the state capacity? Maybe bigger cities or cities that are certified to be better at handling evidence. I'll talk about that. Maybe that's a big determinant. Or maybe there is something about how the experiment is designed. In other words, what are the bottlenecks? And really, we have very limited evidence on this. And I'm kind of excited that this sort of series that, as Anna described, is going to be talking about these questions, because you think we know a ton more about this than we do. I really don't think we know very much, because it's a hard question to get, because you need to keep track not just of experiments, but then what happens with them later. And so that's what we try to do here for the specific setting. But as we, there is so much more to do in this area. And this is also, I'm really grateful that this was introduced earlier. Eva Vivalt and I are the co-PIs of this public good. This is free for now, it's loan funded. What I'm going to do today, and what in general the prediction platform allows you to do, is to say, these are the findings, and this is what people expected on average. And why would you care? Well, often it's it's kind of hard to know about what the research community or the practitioners think. And so it's helpful to say, relative to these priors, if you want this forecast. So what this website does, you just post a project and you design a simple Qualtrics that we help you to do, and it's a 5-10 minute survey. And then you would send it out to people in your area and collect the responses, and then you compare the results to the average forecast. So we have 100 forecasters that we compare to. And if you're interested in this, just Google Social Science Prediction Platform, or also we think that kind of the science paper that we have coming off of also our work earlier with Devin Pope is probably a good place to look. Okay, so this is what the study is. So first of all, the nudge unit, so BITNA is how we're going to abbreviate, works with the city. And it's actually, just to be clear here, the concern about the variable is initiated by the city. It's the city that cares. There's a target outcome. So it's not like there is some academic, nothing wrong with that, but that has something in mind. It's really the city's problem that needs to be solved. So the city and the BIT, the nudge unit, work together to change the wording to address the issue. They run this RCT, and importantly, the city obviously learned the results. There is a brief report that goes to the relevant staff and to the office of the mayor. There is a write-up of 1 to 2 pages that tends to want to be simple. And so in principle, this is a case where you're kind of checking all the boxes in terms of gathering evidence and reporting back. But what do we know about whether then this evidence was or was not adopted? This is where we go back later. This is in years, for about a year. It took us 2020 to 22, and we do a survey and adoption. We ask them, what document are you using? And I'll show you a couple examples of this coming up. So as I said, this in principle is a setting where if there is adoption somewhere, it probably would be it would be higher here than in other cases. Why, for example? Because in many cases, let's say that you're thinking about a cash transfer. Well, if a cash transfer is successful, still to adopt it at scale, you need to have the money for the cash transfer. In this case, to adopt something just meant sending out a mailer, physical or email. In many cases, that was sent routinely, or if not, it's a relatively small cost. So it's compared to other situations, adoption should be easier to come by. Okay, so let's say that in the how do we code adoption? Sometimes there's multiple treatment arms. So without going too much into the details, there was nothing critical here, but basically, if at least if one of the treatment arms that are nudges was using communication after your RCT, we code it as adoption. And so let me just show you an example. It's probably easier than okay. So this is the RCT in 2017. The left one is the control. Okay, this is the typical letter that the municipality sent. So our records indicate you still owe on the court case listed above. This is the courtesy reminder. It sort of has all that information. It has, it does try to have like underlying and so on, but there is kind of a lot of different pieces to it. Now, the nudge treatment kind of basically does a few things. First of all, emphasizes when the payment is due, emphasizes the delinquent amount, and basically in this box, like, what are the things you need to do? Okay, and basically it's an attempt to kind of simplify how this is done. Okay, so then the question is, how does the letter look like that the city is sending for this traffic citation a few years later? This is what it looks like. So you can see that it looks very much like the one on the right. It still has the box here. It has the box here. There are some small changes, but if I flick back and forth kind of a couple times, you can see that it's really quite clear that it's a lot closer to the one on the right than the left. And we actually kind of did some also machine measurements of closeness, and we can validate our coding. But so basically in this case, you would say yes, adoption. When would you say no adoption? In two cases. Number one, if the letter looks more like the control letter, the one on the left, or if there is no letter sent. Okay. Okay, excellent. So we are now coming to the key result. The key results would come in two forms. Number one, how much adoption there is. That's on this slide. And number two, where does adoption take place? Okay. So the first one, well, the question is, what are benchmark numbers? So one benchmark for adoption would be in what share of trials that was the nudge treatment which had a positive effect size. This is the first one here, had a positive effect size. And so from that perspective, you might expect 79% take-up rate if you adopted every time it was positive. If you require it to be significant, that would be more like 45%. Now, what did our predictors think? Turns out here there isn't a big difference between academics and academics in different areas or practitioners. They expect about 30%, 32%. This is this number here, okay? And now compared to that, I'm about to show you the actual adoption. That was 27%. So actually pretty close to what the experts said and significantly lower than either of the first two green bars, which are, you can think of as the benchmarks for if evidence adoption responded to statistical evidence or economic evidence of an effect. Okay, so then the question is, all right, so, well, when were things adopted? So I'm going to break it down by those factors, the evidence-based view, that what matters is the evidence, the organization-based view, and the view that it's a lot about experimental design. So what do these bars show? This is, we're going to look at three cases. The case where there is a zero effect to the trial, the case where there is a positive effect, but not statistically significant, and the case where the nudge effect is positive and significant. Now, the gray bars are not the findings, to be clear. Those are what experts predicted would happen in each of those three groups. So experts thought when it's zero or negative, adoption maybe 10% of the time. You might still want to adopt if you think the wording is better, even if there is no evidence from the trial. And then that would increase, so adoption would be nearly 50% when the evidence is positive and significant. Now, when you look at the data, it's pretty remarkable how flat it is. So in other words, statistical significance does not predict adoption, either statistically or economically. It's really, adoption is pretty constant across, which was really surprising to us. And as you can see, surprising to most people in the audience. And by the way, this is kind of why it's important to get the predictions ex ante, because kind of exposed once you see the result, we're always all 20 on 20. So that's, but maybe it's not statistical significance. It's also like the effect size. And here we split the results into third in percentage point. This is the bottom third, the middle, and the top third. So here there is a little bit more of an evidence of an increase, but when you split it into deciles, which is what we do here, it really doesn't look that compelling. And so our take is there is a little bit of evidence maybe that effect size may have an impact, but it's really it's kind of not that obvious. Okay, so the view that adoption responds strongly to evidence, we don't think comes out very convincingly in this data. So what does it respond to? Well, the possibility is state capacity. There is some organizations really need to have a certain size, need to have an ability to deal with evidence. And so here we have two proxies. One is the idea that there is a kind of a benefit to scale. So bigger cities are more likely to be able to adopt because they have the scale to, say, have some evidence-based officers and so on. And that's by city size. The other one is that the nudge units certified which cities appear to be more evidence-based. This, in some sense, is kind of circular, but especially given that the circularity, there is really limited evidence that there is a difference. The cities above or below median size are quite comparable, and really the certified versus the not certified too. So the share of evidence adoption given the trials is not that different in those two groups. But another possibility that relates to organization in a different way is the staff presence. So many people say, I ran an experiment and then the key staff person left and that was the end of it. And that certainly, could be important. And so we kept track of whether at least one of the key staff people involved in the experiment was still there 3 years later and how that related to adoption. And here, there is some evidence this difference is nearly statistically significant. It's kind of a, sizable difference, but not, it's sort of at the margin significant. So maybe some evidence that staff retention, even as endogenous as it is, could have a part to it, but let's call it suggestive. So what was going on? So here is the elephant in the room. Let me just kind of give the message away here, just also kind of to make sure, probably if there is two things you want to remember for today is that adoption doesn't respond to much to evidence and what I'm about to show you. So just kind of to give a heads up, you made it this far. This is, I think, will be something that you may take away from this, which is there were actually two kinds of experiment that these nudge units run, which we call pre-existing versus new. What is the difference? Okay, new communication is if the city had not been sending letters, for example, let's say for DMV renewal before the trial, the nudge unit comes in and says, hey, let's kind of work together on sending out letters, and then they might send a nudge and a control letter or compare the nudge letter to the control group of not sending a letter. And then the adoption would be, are you sending letters in the years after that with the nudge content? Now, in pre-existing communication, in this case, the city was sending letters every quarter, every year, and what the nudge unit did was just randomize the content. Okay? And so here is the difference, which experts did not anticipate, nowhere near the size anticipated, is basically when the communication was pre-existing, the adoption is very high. That's kind of the good news. So if you are sending the letters every year for, I don't know, DMV renewal, you change the wording in the years after the experiment towards the better wording, the more effective one, 67% time. So that's great. But it's a big but. If instead the city had not been sending letters before and it's the first time they do it as part of the trial, then adoption is abysmal, 12%. And by the way, notice if you are really kind of eagle-eyed, you might see that the number of new communications is way more. It's 52 compared to 21, because the nudge units were especially excited to teach cities or to enable them to communicate more. That's why the average is not, like, adoption is not the average between 12 and 67%. It's a lot closer to 12%, because most of the trials were of the new type. Okay, so what is going on? Why does it make that much of a difference? And by the way, this is one of those things we didn't anticipate that this would play a bigger role. We almost didn't collect this evidence. We just tried to be as thorough as possible, and then expose is like, and then at some point we had this aha moment. And what is the aha moment? Okay, so the first possibility, not the aha moment, is it's about cost. Basically, what if there is no money in the budget for the materials? Okay, and it's not that, because the online, if you restrict to online communication where there's no marginal, there's no cost of communication per se, on the cost of stuff, you get the same difference in new and pre-existing. Okay, so what do we think? Another thing is could be, is it like state capacity? Is it that the cities that are sending the pre-existing communications are different? Is there some city-specific thing? We can look at things within a city and we get the same evidence. So here is what we think is going on. Okay, and then we can discuss whether, in the Q&A, whether it makes sense to people or not. But this is how we think of it. Think that there is two costs of adoption. One was the one that initially we had in mind, which is C2, which is, okay, you got to change your content. That's actually not to adopt the nudge run. That's actually not that costly in this context. But there is another cost, which is sending a communication at all. That would be C1. Now, if you have ongoing communication, there is no C1, because every year there is money in the budget and so on. You're going to have a process for sending that yearly letter, whether it's about tax payment, garbage, and so on. So you only need to pay C2 if you're going to adopt the wording of the nudge treatment. But if you're in the new treatment, okay, in order to, in the years after the experiment, to also send the communication with the nudge content, you need to pay C1 and C2, because you need to make sure to send the communication and then make it the nudge one. And so basically, if C1 is a lot bigger than C2, there will be a lot bigger barriers when you have this kind of new communication. So that's sort of how we think of it. And really, the evidence that is very consistent with that, we think, comes from this graph, which is, let's kind of break down, in the cases of pre-existing and new, what happened to the adoption of evidence. So the green is that, okay, the nudge was adopted. Okay, so we know the 67%. And so in the case where things are sent every year, 24% with pre-existing, 24% they kept sending things, but just they used the control arm. They didn't adopt the nudge. That's okay. Maybe the nudge wasn't as effective. And only in 10% of the case, they send no communication at all. But look at what it looks like for the case of new communication. We said 12% was the adoption. Okay, all of the other cases, 46 cases out of 52, after the BIT-NA runs the experiment with the city, no communication. Basically, there's just no follow-through. The city doesn't send the letter at all. So what is the dog that doesn't bark? This is not like a case where they send the communication, but it's a control wording. No, it's just not sending communication at all. That's why to us, it looks like really that C1 cost. The idea, the hurdle here is sending any communication, which the pre-existing group didn't have because there's a process to it. That's really what we think is a big difference. And like, we went back to the BIT Nigerians and like, oh, that makes so much sense. But that hadn't been on there or our radar. And so this is kind of one of those cases where research really kind of doesn't just measure things, but like, brings up a new factor that exposed is completely obvious, but kind of ex ante wasn't thought to be really that important. And what is obvious about this, we call it organizational inertia, that look, in pre-existing, the city, there's staffing assigned every year to sending this letter. So, that there is a cycle to it. And so, yes, it's not that costly to change the communication. But in the new case, instead, there is really going to be inertia to make that one-time mailer be replicated year after year. You've got to change some process. The next year, people are like, oh, I remember we sent one last year, but who's going to take care of it this year and so on? And then it just doesn't happen. And this is kind of, we did a survey of cities to ask them, does this make sense to you? Like, what would you need? Like, we kind of gave them a vignette of, suppose that you sort of, there's some evidence and you collected, what would stand in the way of adopting that? Okay. So, or said otherwise, how helpful would each of the following be for supporting your city to send the communication routinely? And the top one that, see, like respondents, staff working in cities say is prioritization. So how do we interpret this? We kind of think like, sure, if like somebody, basically like you run an experiment one time and then you have this idea, oh, maybe we should do it again. But like nobody's really kind of supporting you on that. And then the thing falls by the wayside. Okay. And it could be the funding for communication costs and the logistics and more staff FT hours. Maybe it kind of takes more staff to be able to do this. That's sort of, we think of organization inertia as like a umbrella term incorporating all of these different things. So before I finish, let me also point out that after we found this result, we went back to the literature and we actually reanalyzed this kind of this great Brazil paper where it looks like, in light of our analysis, that the impact of the nudge letter that they give in Brazil is actually bigger for cities that were already sending letters along the lines that we're saying. And also this meta-analysis by kind of Michael Kramer, Galland, Ostapshov, and Thomas that also basically summarizes the adoption at scale of USAID grants, RCTs coming from grants, and reports the larger adoption if there was a pre-existing platform. So one of the things is that if you're running a RCT, maybe it's useful for you to think if it's kind of more like pre-existing or not. So these are the conclusions, like some of the different implications. The first one is that we've done so much progress in the social sciences in the last 20 years to actually gather evidence that could play into policy, but a lot less so in sort of understanding what happens when we gather the evidence to translating that into policy, the bottlenecks that are in the title of and the content of this paper. And so that seems like we need many more papers on that. The second one is when you're designing an experiment, you might want to think about the adoption. So for example, like if there is an arm that you kind of suspect that the city, the country, the town, whatever, would have a hard time adopting, you may decide not to run it. If the whole point of it is adoption, if the point is some also learning lessons on channels, that's kind of a separate story. So you might incorporate this in the trade-off of experimental design. And finally, this is kind of a very behavioral economics lesson. In a way, it's about choice architecture. So when you're running an RCT, we need to think about adoption the same way we think about retirement savings. Why do I make this parallel? One of the things we learned from inertia effects and default effects is that in retirement savings, when you hire people for 401ks, it makes a big difference if the default is opt-in or opt-out. Are you invested by default? Do you have to opt in? The small thing has a big impact on participation in the stock market. Kind of the same thing here. If you think about in the new communication, the default is to go back to how things were before. And defaults are very powerful. So what we might think about is in organizations that run experiments, can you build the pathways such that there is a pathway to adoption made clear even after the experiment is concluded? So let me just tell you about three things. We are basically in the next research, and I'm curious about thoughts on this too, like Elizabeth and Woojin and I are interested in doing more of this because we think it's kind of, it's an important nexus and underscore nexus in the literature. And we sort of think of three questions running through the idea of bottlenecks to adoption. The first one is, well, what makes cities or organizations even experiment? What are the ideas that policy centers like cities are interested in? Because like this was taken as given in this case, but that's kind of an interesting to look at. And the second is when you run, that was kind of number one. The second one, when you run things, what do you even know about how, if you were to run the same experiment in many cities, would the results be very different? What would explain them? Because that may be, if they kind of vary a lot, that would play also into the adoption. And the final one is kind of more like what I discussed today, is what are the bottlenecks that stand in the way of adoption? Can we do interventions there? And But so we kind of think of what we were able to do with the nudge units as kind of not as a last, but more as a first step in kind of this process to better understand how evidence-based policy has kind of this is in this larger context with these different bottlenecks. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Stefano. Super interesting. And we have a bunch of questions here. And so I'm going to take the prerogative of asking the first question. And I think you,
That'd be lovely.
in the interest of time, you didn't do the paper full justice, right? So for those of you who want to see the full paper, I think it's forthcoming in Journal of Political Economy. Is that?
Yes.
But you can also, you can find ungated copies online. But you do this really exhaustive kind of like all of these different features of the experiments, and it has the organizational inertia explanation does have a little bit of a feel of we've ruled everything else out. And so one of my question is, is there any evidence? So if you think it's about cost, right? Would you expect to see variation in adoption based on whether it was, a very low cost, like it's just sending an email versus something more elaborate? It doesn't seem like it would take that much staffing to send emails, but I could be wrong about that. Or what would be what would be the next stage and maybe it's an intervention design to try to see if you could actually pin down that the mechanism is, like, for instance, having the staff member in place whose job it is to send out the communications.
Yeah, thank you. So this is it was a process for us to try to think about what are the pieces of evidence that we can rule in, rule out as many things as possible. And it's completely true that organization inertia is an umbrella explanation. I mean, it's like we're not really pinning down one particular one. So for example, one question which is interesting is, would it be enough to remind cities a year later, hey, this is about the time when you might send a communication? Would it be enough to just kind of give them a call and say, are you interested in, like, are you planning to do it, and so on, like almost a planning reminder? That would be quite cheap to do, and that could be one arm. It could be that that's not enough, that they it may not be directly the cost of material, but somehow gathering the addresses and getting things sent to the right time, the right people, like, could still take staffing. So cost in the form of staffing FTEs certainly could be the case. And it could be that they sort of did it, but then it sort of wasn't that central to the organization. There were distractions, so it kind of takes some focusing. So yes, we're thinking of interventions like from the simple reminder to asking them at the design stage, suppose that this arm is more effective than the other. What would stand in the way then of them becoming the new arm that you send? And by the way, this is something that in the context of firm, tech companies, in the context of the A/B testing, some of the, firms, without kind of making names, basically address this by running A/B testing experiments where if arm A does better than B, it automatically gets adopted. So that way you kind of remove all the inertia. But of course, in many cases, this cannot be done. But basically, can you get buy-in at the experimental stage to be doing this later? So these are some of the things that we have in mind for the future, and we don't know which one would work. Obviously, if a reminder worked, that would be cheaper than providing staffing, but so we're going to try to think about that in the future.
Yeah. Okay, so some questions. So here's a question from Liz Glazer, who Liz Stefano was director of the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice in New York City. And so was very engaged with feeding evidence. And so Liz says, question close to her heart, she says, I'm wondering whether you found that adoption was greater if the nudge unit was located closer to the executive branch. So for example, embedded in a mayor's office, versus, for example, in some agencies' policy and planning unit. That is, would you have recommendations of how organizationally the nudge unit should be structured to maximize adoption given political, budgetary, and other obstacles?
Great question. So I can speak a little bit to this. So there are some cities by size and by decision basically had like some evidence evaluation office that was like above the department, that was kind of an overarching organization. In some other cases, we worked directly with a department that handled everything sort of inside. And when I say we, I'm sorry, I should say the NAD unit. And so we don't find that makes a sizable difference. So we have that kind of in the result. That was something that was brought up, and we came up with this categorization. And in both of those cases, we find that new versus pre-existing has this kind of really big impact. But it certainly is, that's something certainly worthwhile looking at in future work, kind of exactly the extent of the collaboration.
Yeah. So here's a question about is the difference that you're finding between new versus pre-existing communications, is that conditioned only on the set of trials for which there were positive significant effects, or is that across everything? And did you look for any heterogeneity, I guess, in the new versus pre-existing effect conditional on the level of evidence?
Great question. So it's across all of them. But so another way to rephrase this question, if I understand correctly, is to say, in the cases where you have pre-existing communication, where you sort of remove the biggest hurdle, is adoption more responsive to evidence? Because that's kind of the interaction that comes to mind. And largely it's yes, but keep in mind that those are just 21. So we do have that graph. I have it in some version of presentation, that the slope is steeper, but it kind of depends a little bit how you look at it. But that's what you expect, which is not only would you be more likely to adopt, but you should be more responsive to evidence. So that's my.
And do you find, what about when there was no pre-existing, is there still just like a complete unresponsiveness?
Yeah, when there was no pre-existing,
because there's nothing, right?
Flat.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So here's a question.
That's kind of.
Yeah.
No, it's a great question, because that's exactly how you'd kind of predict it to be.
Yeah. So here's a question from a PhD student and former BIT Nudge Unit employee who's studying evidence-based policymaking. Stefano, what do you think are some of the remaining big questions on barriers, enablers to evidence adoptions that researchers should try to understand?
So many. So it's, I think, well, some of it even are, whatever we're observing here is all conditional on having run an RCT. So, how selected are the cities, like how many things were ruled out. In fact, like here you're talking about cases of non-adoption for cities that went through the lawyers and all, got through all the approval. Like, so there is kind of a lot of selection. Like, what do we know about what happens at this stage? What do we know about how the evidence was communicated to the city? So clearly the attempt was to communicate it post-trial as clearly as possible, but maybe one could have done a first meeting and then a follow-up meeting 3 months later to remind people, or that could happen. And as I know you and I were discussing just a moment ago, could one do some follow-up interventions later to assist the city in implementing, or does the city feel like they need more evidence? It didn't look like in this case, and they actually, for example, they recall the finding in our calls. In like 15 out of 16 cases, they could recall the findings. So it actually seemed like they knew what the results were. That wasn't the barrier. But in principle, I think there is there are a lot of there are a lot of directions that we just don't have good evidence on. And part of the difficulty is that to gather this evidence to an extent, you need to run several RCTs. That's the difficulty, is to, in this case, we inherited the sample, but sort of now that we're kind of trying to generate our own, is like, how do you create an experiment where you have not just one RCT, but like 50 or 100 of them? But there's some question, therefore, can be addressed hypothetically. I mean, there is various strategies, but it seems to me like this is a setting where that we need kind of so much evidence. There's a lot of open questions.
Yeah, and super, and such an important neglected area too, right? Because I was saying to Stefano before the lecture that I was just reading this report from the NSF's Center for Statistics on Science and Engineering, which are all about the transfer of knowledge from invention to innovation. And knowledge transfer is really important to universities when it comes to things that can be patented, commercialized. But we also have this really important problem of knowledge transfer for the public sector, right? So how do we actually translate knowledge, evidence into findings? And I think there's a lot of opportunity for universities to do more on this. But in order to help our universities do more on this, we actually need to know more.
Yeah. Right. And even granting agencies, they could earmark like a small part of the grant budget for like tracing out dissemination of the research or adoption.
Yeah, we know very little. So here's a question. Were you able to test, or do you know anything about whether the adoption rate was higher in cases where the experiment involved a fiscal or revenue benefit for the city? So, for example, or a larger fiscal benefit. So the effect size is about take up, right?
Yes.
Not necessarily about how much revenue or is being generated for the city. So were you able to look at that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we really we couldn't come up in this setting with a good measure that translates. So the outcome variable is one the city cares about, but we don't have a dollar amount to it, like how much they would save if people renew their license online, if they show up for the bond, and so that would be a great thing to do if one had a good way to do it. I think it's sort of quite hard in this context. If we had done everything from scratch, you'd sort of want to try to do it. In this particular context, it was harder to do. Also, like some things are not really easy to monetize. So this morning with a representative from a county in Wisconsin, Elizabeth Woojin and I were in a conversation, and the county representative brought up the issue of lead pipes and basically kind of trying to alert and test kids for lead in the body, because we now know that has kind of very negative impacts. Now, if you can address that issue, it's not like the monetary saving isn't really monetary into the city. It's like, is the health of the kids and of the community. So some things will be quite hard to put a dollar amount. That's easier done for A/B testing in firms, but for other cases you can. But this design was not its strength, I think, to do that.
Yeah, or public safety or any number of other kinds of outcomes, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
So here's a question, and this might be, another of the unexplored questions that, PhD students, actually myself, you should be taking notes on. Is there any research about the adoption of evidence in other kinds of contexts besides adoption into policy? So for example, is there any research on whether existing academic research is taken into account when interventions or programs are being designed, which I think is maybe a slightly different question than the adoption into policy?
Yeah, this is also an important question, because in some sense, the adoption definition we have is quite narrow. I mean, it is probably the most obvious, but adoption into the next policy is only one aspect of it. What if what this RCT does, it teaches the city to do more RCTs, or it leads them to adopt this wording in a different context, or it leads the city to communicate with a group of other cities to move something in a direction. So we try to keep track of some of this within the range of the interviews we had with the city officials, and but it's hard to verify and to do it in an extensive way. I think that's, if you had a network of cities, like getting a sense like how does innovation spread in government circles? Like, I mean, I was talking to Carl Knox at Stanford, who kind of say, yeah, for example, the Florida guys have a conference, and there is people from neighboring states, the educators, but that information doesn't spread as easily to Oregon, for example. So you could imagine there is some policy diffusion, a theme that Woojin and I studied, and I think that's also kind of largely understudied. But it'd be super interesting if you seeded, if you gave some information to a particular town and you knew how this town is connected, to see the spread of that, that would be a wonderful thing if we could learn more about that too.
Yeah. So here's a question about do you know, because these were BIT and maybe OES interventions, but do you know whether the interventions were actually implemented by the policy partners themselves using their staff, their systems in all cases during the RCTs, or were some of the communications sent by researchers? Because maybe, getting the agencies to implement at least once can help to overcome some of the inertia.
My understanding is that all of these were implemented by the policy partner and the researchers. So let me just draw a distinction. In the second paper, we use only the BIT North America. In that case, there typically was not even involvement of an outside researcher, but there was like a research staff within the NAD unit that worked with the city, but then it was the city that sent the letter. So basically, you could think of the nudge unit coming in and giving some training or ideas for what the letter should be. But ultimately, the cost of all the mailer, the staff was one of the city. Now, in OES, which is the one at the White House at the federal level, it's still the departments that bear the cost. But in that case, there's collaboration with outside researchers too. But again, I think then my understanding is that the communication itself is sent out through the actual policy organization.
Yeah. So here's a question. I think it's a great question. It's near and dear to my heart because in criminal justice, we've been having a conversation about what counts as evidence. Like our RCT is the only gold standard evidence. And there's a question. These are all RCTs, and most intervention studies are not RCTs. Most policy ADs are not backed by RCTs. Right. Do you have thoughts about knowledge transfer for studies that are not backed by a similar level of evidence, but might involve, say, descriptive or quasi-experimental design?
Right. Right. So, I mean, for absolutely. So there is different kinds of evidence. We know that, for example, to diagnose the negative impacts of smoking on health, we didn't rely on RCT. That observational evidence was so strong, epidemiological, right? That basically we felt like we could decide based on that. So sometimes correlation comes pretty close to causation, often not. So we do worry, and designs like either randomized trials, or sometimes you can have things like regressions continuities where you're on one side of a, let's say that you have money for lead pipes if you have more than 5,000 people and not less, then you can sort of have evidence that is about as credible as an experiment. But and sometimes it's kind of just descriptive, and then we just don't necessarily know the interpretation, but it's still a descriptive finding. So in principle, the same logic applies to those kinds of evidence. But an interesting question implied by the point you raise is, when will policymakers be interested in running an experiment, and when do they just want the answer already? Because often when BIT goes to cities, like, no, we don't have the answer because, we're going to need to experiment. And the city often is like, really, can't we just, no, we the experiment, gathering evidence is really critical. And so there are interesting questions there also about when is there the bandwidth of the policy partner to actually generate new evidence versus wanting to rely on some kind of consulting advice.
Yeah, I do also think that there was this paper. I think it was an AER paper. It was called "Methods Matter," about the reliability
bias, or
yeah. But it was one of the things that I thought was for the audience too is that if you compare, sort of looking at whether you see a spike in the distribution of test statistics just above, a threshold where you shouldn't see a spike, like right just at, 1.96. And you don't see much of a spike for RCTs, which is kind of like, that's one of the reasons why we think RCTs are good. But if you also don't see a spike for regression discontinuity designs, which Stefano just mentioned,
exactly.
Even for difference in difference, if you control for field and journals. So it's like, I think we're getting better using some of these quasi-experimental designs, and it potentially
But
could
the
be
instrumental variable had a really big one.
Yeah, it doesn't look so good.
Yeah,
But that
yeah.
was back,
No,
but that
I
was
love
also
that.
back from like 2000. I mean, the papers were like 2013, 2018
I
when
agree with you.
yeah.
I agree with you, and I think that paper by Belbrador and co-authors, like in general, using the evidence on looking at it also from research transparency is really important. Yeah, that's I'm glad you brought it up.
Well, so we're already over, and there's lots more questions. But what we'll do is we'll send you, Stefano, all of the questions in the chat, and so everybody in the chat, we're gonna make sure that Stefano gets all your questions and feedback. Thank you so much for kicking off our Research to Solve Problems lecture series. We're really grateful to have you.
Thank you so much, and thanks everyone. We appreciate it.
Great. Bye, everybody.